Hello, everyone, and welcome to the National Museum of the American Indians Professional Development Series, Native New York in Your Classroom. Thank you for joining us. I'm Amy Temerance, and I'm the lead cultural interpreter at the museum. Now, this Native New York in Your Classroom is a free 4-part webinar series designed for education professionals who teach about the Native nations of New York State. Now, feeling a sense of belonging is important for each and every one of us, both to families as well as friend groups, shared language groups, and our homelands or countries of origin. Culture is often the way we express that belonging. And so as we begin today's program, we want to take a moment to gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their homes here today. Land acknowledgements like this are a first step in creating collaborative, accountable, and respectful relationships with Indigenous nations and communities. The museum has developed a one-page handout for more guidance on land acknowledgement practices in your classroom. As I mentioned, I work at the National Museum of the American Indian, which is part of the Smithsonian Institution, a complex of museums, research centers, libraries, and even a zoo. We have 2 exhibition locations, one in Washington, D.C. on the National Mall, which is in the photograph on the far left, and in New York City in Lower Manhattan, which is in the photograph on the center. Our museum's collection is housed at the Cultural Resources Center in Suitland, Maryland, which is the photo on the far right. One of the most common questions we receive from teachers and students, and even our general visitors, is why we are called the National Museum of the American Indian. Now, the term American Indian is really a general way to describe the Indigenous peoples and communities in the Western Hemisphere. But there are nearly 600 federally recognized tribes within the United States alone, each with its own history, social and political structure, cultural practices, and languages. And since our museum represents people from the entire hemisphere, you can understand why a term like American Indian or Native American is inadequate to really describe the vast diversity that exists among and between Indigenous communities. Some people have preferences for a non-specific term, and so for the purposes of our talk today, we'll be using both terms, Native American and American Indian, when we speak generally about Indigenous peoples. The museum has also created a one-page handout called The Impact of Words, which we have posted a link to in the chat, and then we'll send out after the webinar. And this document just further describes some tips for choosing appropriate language when speaking about Native people. Let's go ahead and talk about our plan for today. In this webinar, we'll be focusing on introducing the foundational theory and skills of dialogue. A dialogue is a methodological tool that can help you navigate conversations around a variety of topics and issues. We'll also provide ways for you to navigate conflicts and challenges in dialogue and create roadmaps for how to build deeper conversations with your students. Today's webinar will include both presentation and small group work. I'd now like to introduce the facilitator for today's session, Braden Painter. Braden is the Director of Methodology and Practice at the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. Braden?
Thanks, Amy, and hello, everyone. Thanks for spending some time with us today. Appreciative both of your time today, of the work that you do every day, and of what you're gonna do with your students in the future, thinking about both this exhibit and the wider content that it connects to. Wanted to start today, as Amy was saying, by letting you all know that I am on unceded territory of the Western Abenaki, the Pecumtuck, and the Nipmuc. And I'm very grateful for the ways people have cared for this land in the past, and we do our best to care for it today ourselves. So wanted to tell you a little bit about who we are as the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. If you haven't run across us before, we are a network of museums, historic sites, places of memory around the world. We've got more than 300 members in more than 65 countries around the world, And the thing that brings everybody together is a belief that our historic sites have an important role to play in helping our communities build more just and humane futures. And that we connect around the world to allow that to happen, to better support that. Right? And we're really interested as we do that in not just looking at history for history's sake, but really saying, how do we connect that past into our present world so that we understand our world, we understand ourselves now, and how do we then generate action out of that? So how do we help our students, how do we help our visitors move into being active participants in shaping the world around them? Right? A big chunk of how we do that is dialogue, right? As Amy said. So that's part of how we are, why we are connecting today. Also, the National Museum of the American Indian is one of our wonderful members, right, that make up the engine that drives the coalition forward and where the learning comes from. So what I'll be sharing with you today comes out of the work of members around the world. Right? If you want to learn more about the coalition, I'm always happy to chat about it. You can check out our website too. Just want to let you know where this information is coming from today. All right. So let's get started with a couple of big ideas for how to build conversations that expand learning around the Native New York exhibit. And wanted to start with an idea that is foundational to almost all of the work that we do. When we think about public programming, when we think about how we navigate internal and external conversations in organizations, when we think about how do we help the public engage with exhibits and with history around the world. It's something that's called the Four Truths. It comes to us out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa. If you are familiar with truth commissions, they are something that started particularly in South America following the falls of dictatorships there. As people have been saying, hey, how do we move a community? How do we move a society? How do we move a country out of a period of sustained human rights violations and into a period of greater justice? Right? One of the key things that comes up as people work on this around the world over and over again is this idea of truth-telling. Right? We have to have a chance for people to say, this is what happened. Right? This is how we have treated each other. This is what we've experienced, and we can go forward, but we will go forward with honest truth as part of this. In the South African example, which is the most famous Truth Commission, typically, right, this is following the end of apartheid, legalized segregation in South Africa. You get historians and professors and judges and lawyers, and everybody's listening to these thousands and thousands of hours of testimony. And they hear what you would expect people to hear, right? That different people have different perspectives on a historical event. Right? We talk about that all the time in history, in school, wherever you may be. Right? Different people, different perspectives. Right? So somebody who's part of the security forces will remember a protest differently than somebody who was a protester. Not unexpected. But what they also started to find is that within an individual, there were different understandings of a historical event, right? Not between people, but within somebody. They had these different layers of how they would understand something that had happened to them or that they were connected to in some way. Okay? And the first of these was the forensic truth. These are the facts, the details, the measurables. This is how what often ends up as the official word in history books, right? It's the thing that museums and teachers, we are often most comfortable with and seen as experts in. Forensic truth is contested, right? But it often sits there and is what's thought to be the uncontestable facts. Right. Personal truth is the way that an individual experienced an event, right? So how did you, what was it like for you to live through something? Right? Or if you weren't there yourself, how did you hear about it? How did you learn about it? Who told you about it? Was it from your parents who introduced it to you, right? So it can become a multi-generational experience as well. Really quick example of how forensic truth and personal truth can both be simultaneously different but valid, right? So if we all walk outside in the morning, it's 55 degrees. Some people are going to feel quite chilly then. Some people are going to feel quite warm. Some people are going to have a jacket. Some people won't have a jacket, right? So we have a shared forensic truth, the temperature, but we have very different lived experiences of what that morning is. So different, but all equally valid. Not the same thing, but equally valid. Okay, social truth are the big narratives that a society tells about a given event. Okay, so this is where people often start to accumulate narratives of, of an event that hold power, right? That have the ability to give sort of meaning and consequence to, that say, because this thing happened, therefore we must. Because an event has occurred in the way that we're talking about it, we must do this next thing. Right? Social truth, not everybody believes it. Right? It's often contested. There are multiple social truths that exist within a society at any given moment, but they're the ones that hold enough power to mobilize broad action. And the fourth is reconciliatory truth. And reconciliatory, like the rest of these words, is a word that gets used in very different ways in different contexts. We'll use it different ways in different contexts. In this particular context, what we mean by reconciliatory truth is how a single individual comes to terms with a perceived injustice in the past. Okay, so a single individual coming to terms with a perceived injustice in the past. Oftentimes, reconciliation is thought of as being only a positive. In this context, it can be a negative thing. Right? The way that somebody comes to terms with a perceived injustice is to take action that sort of spreads more harm in the world. So examples of what this might look like to walk us through something that's often in the news, right? The American Civil War, contested piece of memory in the United States. So a forensic truth of the American Civil War would be dates that it occurred, right? Dates of battles, numbers of people involved, right? Dates of a particular speech, the text of that speech, right? All of those things kind of on down the line. Right? Personal truths could be all over the place, or kind of even more broad, right? You have personal truths and experiences of people who served in the war, of people who were at home, of people who avoided serving, of people who were living in Italy and heard about it through the newspaper. Right? You've got history of people who are alive now who, when you say, hey, do you remember where you learned about this? They say, oh yeah, third grade, so-and-so told me about it, right? Or, oh, it was my grandfather who would always take me to the battlefields when I was a kid and would talk about it. Or, hey, I was at the Smithsonian and saw something, right, in one of the exhibits, and that's where I learned about it. Right? So we have these learned experiences of it. And those personal truths are powerful when we want to try and help somebody grow and imagine a new understanding of the world. We're contesting not just with the information, the forensic truth they hold, but we're also working with the personal truth and the social context of how they learned their information. Okay. Social truths, right? Two big narratives that are easy to pull out. The Civil War was about, right, slavery, or it was not about slavery, right? And you can hear each of those comes with a therefore, right? Because the Civil War was not about slavery, therefore we must, right? Or because the Civil War was about slavery, therefore we must, right? And you can hear that big, powerful argument that each of those makes. We'll leave this mostly for another day, but as somebody who used to work in Washington, D.C. at the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site, slavery had something to do with it. All right. And the last is reconciliatory truth. Right? And so an example, many examples from the Civil War, right? as people think about memorialization, as people think about grieving, as people turn to hate in different ways. Right? And so you could see one example of that would be the statues and monuments that get put up, right? United Daughters of the Confederacy perceives an injustice in the way that the story of the war is being told and how it is being remembered and what some of the consequences for the social order in the United States are. And so they immediately begin taking action on that, right? And erecting monuments and statues around the country to try to rectify that. Right? From the moment those monuments go up, they are creating new perceived injustices for other people who then contest those, right? So part of the reason for us to be engaged in reconciliatory truth as educators, as museum folks, is to try and build versions of reconciliatory truth for ever wider groups of folks. Okay, I know this is a bunch, so we're gonna pause there and we're gonna kind of dive into this. We're going to give people a chance to practice thinking through these a little bit. So, and we want to take as a topic, right, the colonization of the Americas. Right? So we're going to put you into some small groups, and we are going to give you about 6 or 7 minutes as a small group to spend some time kind of applying this idea to the colonization of the Americas, right? So what are some of the forensic truths? What are some of the personal truths? What are some of the social truths? And what are some of the reconciliatory truths that you have seen people trying over the years, right? So when you're in your small groups, say hi to each other, give everybody, introduce yourselves, and then kind of work through these, and we'll come back together and unpack them as a group. Right, so your breakout rooms should be opening, and we'll see you all in just a few moments, a couple minutes. All right, I think everybody is back. This is, I know, not nearly long enough to actually dive into all of this subject, right? We just want to get you starting a little bit. But using the chat box right now, let's kind of talk through this a little bit more. What are some of the forensic truths that you came up with? Some of the forensic truths of the colonization of the Americas. Just throw a couple in there. Maria says, we got through one truth. Fair enough. Right? That's okay. We're practicing. Right? So chronicles, artifacts, material culture. In 1492, Columbus did something with a boat. Yep, the language of people, maps, population numbers, treaties. You got it. Perfect. Oh, we're getting into right, kind of not just the cultural pieces, but right, a population of buffalo, right? So not just centering humans. Great structures, movies. Yep. Good stuff. What about personal truths? What would be examples of different personal truths over time? Yep, we can gain them from oral histories. Yeah, and I see what Lisa is saying in there, giving equal weight to the stories of community as forensic, not just personal. That is one of the places that we have big conversations about what makes a forensic truth, right? The challenge is there, right? How does oral history count as forensic truth, right? And for a long time, because we're talking about power here, right? Many institutions and schools would say, no, that doesn't, right? But that's shifting and changing and being pushed on. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The way you learned about stuff in school. Yep. Not being respected as Hopi. Yep. Personal ancestry and family culture, right? Yeah. Students absorbing narratives from media as truth. Yep. Because you learned about it because you watched the cowboy movie on TV, right? That's where you learned about this. Yeah. Watching Disney's Pocahontas. There you go. I remember when I watched. I remember when I sang along with. Right? These are those personal experiences. They may not be forensically true, but they sure as heck explain and help you understand how people are thinking the way that they do and why they choose the actions that they take. Yes, right? And so we've got our historical ones, everything from, right, I was a sailor, I was somebody living in wherever, and I remember when this thing happened, right? All the way up through present day experiences, all of those. Yep. All right, social narratives. What are a couple of the big social truths that we have floating around today about this? Yeah, your own process of learning. I like that, Maria. That's a good personal truth of like your process of learning and studying and growing is a part of this too. Yeah. The West was one. Yes, manifest destiny, uninhabited land, real Americans. Yes, right? In that sentence, the West was one. There's a whole lot of things that come with it. Not everybody believes it, right? But there's a big therefore, right? Therefore, because the West was one, therefore it is ours. It must stay this way, right? Big narrative, big consequences, right? Right on down the line. Bringing civility, right? And then there's a set of other narratives, right? That nice one about 1491. There was a world here before. This is Louisiana, right? Narratives of just even what this place is, right? Of filling up that empty void, sure. Right? It's, yeah, literally just on a call with Chris Newell from the Abbey Museum, and he was talking about how he did poorly in his history classes in high school because they would say, yeah, the history starts about 500 years ago. And he was like, no, it's tens of thousands of years old, right? Even just calling something the New World, there you go, right? So big narratives, big social narratives that we live within. Right? All right. What about any reconciliatory truths? Ways that people have tried to come to terms with perceived injustices? Doctrine of discovery. Yes, people are adding good pieces on there, right? All right, so thinking about, right, how do we start to make stuff a little bit right? Returning artifacts, repatriation, land acknowledgements, renaming, considering multiple voices, repatriation, yeah. The way we tell stories, yep. Yeah. Right. And so as we think about this along over the long period of time that we're talking about, right, there's going to be positive and negative kinds of reconciliation. When people are trying to reconcile some of their perceived injustices, right, it's going to lead them at times to lean into some of those stereotypes, some of the hate, some of the damaging behavior, right? It's okay that I seize this land. It's okay. It's justified because some grievance has been done against me in some way, right? So yeah, you can see this, right, around the world as people start to think about how do we make stuff right. Often the pieces you're talking about there, everything from various kinds of reparations, which can take a range of forms, including the return of artifacts and services, monetary, a whole range of things, symbolic reparations, which symbolic renamings are part of that too, right, to all these stories, and a number of other different things, right? Okay, so we're going to kind of pause this there. We could talk about this a lot longer. Friends at NMAI know that I will talk about this all day, right? Sort of the reason we're centering this at the start of the conversation is that when we start thinking about building conversation between people about something like Native New York, it's because when people walk into a conversation, they are carrying all of these things with them, right? And that oftentimes we want to start with our forensic truth because we say, hey, we're educators. We give people forensic truth and then they just change, right? But so often our forensic truth is going to just bounce right off of people. And why is that? It's because they're starting at something like, they're starting with a personal truth or they're operating from a social truth, right? And you have a hard time if somebody's deep in a social truth or they're deep in a personal truth, they have a hard time hearing forensic truth typically, okay? And before you think, hey, this is that thing that everybody I disagree with does, we all do it too. This is part of being human, right? We start with what our parents told us. We start with the foundational experiences of our lives. We start with the big social narratives that we're part of and feel like we belong in, right? So as we start to do this, we have to be making space for people's personal truth and social truth to become part of the conversation if we're going to be able to meet it, acknowledge it, have it add strength to the conversation, and sometimes have it grow and expand and maybe shift over time as they get exposure to new personal truth, new social narratives, new forensic truth, right? And that for us is why, as we try and tackle these spaces with people, dialogue becomes so important, right? Because dialogue is what allows for us to access and understand and share and learn from and grow and connect with people's personal and social truths, as well as just living in the world of the forensic. All right, so when we think about dialogue, we think about it in terms of two big, right, other ways of talking, right? And debate is one of them, right? So we sort of understand dialogue as a communication form along with debate. Debate is important. Debate is when we go into a conversation looking to change somebody else's mind, right? That we want them to end the conversation thinking about the world the same way that we do, right? There are going to be moments that that's important to do, right? They might be a safety reason. As a former park ranger, like, hey, step away from the edge of the Grand Canyon. Please step back now. I need you to think the way I do about this, right? It might be for a particular reason around a value that we need to center as part of a program. We say, hey, that's not language that we allow here, right? We're going to push back on that. Right? There's lots of reasons that we use debate, and debate is powerful. But because debate seeks to put our mind into somebody else's to get them to match us, it misses the amazing learning and interaction that happens when we exist in dialogue, when with the goal of the conversation isn't to change somebody's mind, but to grow collectively. And that for us is what dialogue is, okay? And so dialogue is where we share ideas, information, experiences, and assumptions for the purposes of personal and collective learning, right? And I know oftentimes we want to say, hey, we're going into this, we're talking about this. That means just bring your footnoted facts. But if we're helping people grow, that means we're engaging with, yeah, that information, but it's also experiences and assumptions that are key pieces of structuring folks' behavior, right? When we think about what that then starts to look like in a program, and when you start to look at the toolkit, right, because that can get a little messy, right? So there's a great toolkit that goes along with the exhibit. We worked with NMII to co-create it. You're going to see some things in there that help you think about how to navigate dialogue, right? There's 4 key tools, and then there's an overall structure for it. It's called the arc of dialogue, right? We're not going to spend a ton of time on this today. Just know that it's out there, and that we've got some writing for you if you want to dive into it further for how to structure a conversation with your students and move them along, right? Not starting at, hey, so let's start at the biggest and hardest idea, but let's work our way there across this a set of questions. Let's work our way there through a conversation. In many ways, what this is about building trust between people in a group to work into harder and harder questions. Right? So those early phases, phase 1 and 2, we're building community, we're sharing our diversity of experiences. That's where people are speaking about themselves, right? And we get to hear and understand other people through their, right, through the stories that they tell about themselves. The hardest questions, those questions about who we are collectively, that lives up in phase 3, right? Build enough trust to get there. Phase 4 is where we close a conversation. We've got to have synthesis and closure. If we don't do that, if we just leave ourselves with those biggest questions, people feel unresolved. They feel unable to move forward. So we've got to bring it back down to the individual and think about how you want to move forward. Right? So we reflect on learning as part of our synthesis, and then think about how you want to move forward. Underlying all of this, a key component of dialogue, wherever you might be, is having a common experience. Common experiences help you level hierarchies in dialogue, and they help you give everybody, build trust based on those shared experiences as well. Okay. Examples of what this might look like in the exhibit, because questions are what drive dialogue. If we want to help people learn, questions are the things that are the engine of making that happen, and they're one of those 4 key tools of dialogue and of facilitating dialogue. We're not going to talk about them all today, but if you start with questions, you're a long way home there. Right? So you can see a couple of the way that we might kind of build a conversation around the idea of home, which is one of those key concepts of Native New York. And as you can see that we're going to start with those personal questions, and they're going to start a little bit more accessible. Right? They're going to start in places that are a little bit safer for everybody to dive into together. That you don't need a ton of trust between people. As you move from phase 1 to phase 2, right, we're going to get that more complex. And we're going to start looking for where people have similarities and differences. It's really what is often at the core of helping people learn from each other around these, is where do we have similarities and where do we have differences, looking for both of those. Right? Because you get unexpected similarities and you get unexpected differences. Phase 3, right, those biggest, most challenging questions. This is where we're not saying, hey, can you have many homes? When have you, right? This is, what's our responsibility? Can this happen? Let's talk about us outside of ourselves, right? This is no longer just you. This is about us. Not leaving it there, bring it back down, right? How will you look? How will you care, right? So going back to the personal, back to the learning, and back to the action orientation of this, right? So that we hope that we're building not just knowledge transfer, but behavior change too, right? All right. And this is where it kind of connects with the 4 truths, is that idea of saying, hey, look, if we want to meet folks, we've got to meet them through their personal truth. Right? That's how we understand who we're talking to, and that's how we start to build trust between folks. Okay? If we do that, if we start to be able to hear each other's personal truth, we have a shot at exploring social truth together, okay? And then forming some sort of small-scale reconciliatory truth. Part of the reason that this works really well as a model in schools and in museums is because we get that bedrock of forensic truth to build the conversation on, right? So for the purpose of this, when you were saying, as you were calling out some of those different forensic truths, cool, so as we talk about home, let me show you some of the artifacts that make up that home, that how people live there. Let me show you those treaties. Let me show you the letters. Let's show you, right, all of this evidence, so that as people are exploring their own personal conceptions, they can be broadened by interweaving that forensic truth throughout the experience. All right. I'm going to pause this here. I see the chat box is blinking away. All right. There's a question in there. Yeah. From Maria, maybe it's okay to leave it unresolved. There's a tendency to have the dominant voice, the teacher, usually end the conversation when time's up. Right? This is a big question for that we work with on institutions a lot, is about saying, where do you have to have your authoritative final voice, and where is it okay for you to have people think differently and have different perspectives, right? And that's the thing that we have to do a lot of internal work on, so that we can make space for dialogue. All right, I want to give you one last tool today, right? Because we've kind of gone real big theoretical. We've started to talk about some of the structure you'll find in the toolkit. And I want to give you one, sort of slightly more practical tool here, which is about questions. And this is why you put slides in, because sometimes you forget. I wanted to call out. This is from Yolanda Leyva down at the Museo del Urbano in the Borderlands Public History Lab. The structure that I shared with you, that's a structure that definitely comes out of a Western culture. It's one that we find works in a lot of contexts, but it is written by white people who are of European descent, right? Other cultural structures for dialogue and conversation exist around the world. This is one you can find Yolanda writing about in a toolkit that we have called From Brown v. Board to Education. It was helping students have conversations around race in the school to prison pipeline. I'm happy to drop that to Amy as well for sharing as part of follow-up resources if those are useful to you too. I can't teach this. Yolanda can, but I can't. So I'll teach you what I know, and then there's always space to have others jumping into. All right, so last thing I want to share with you is the tool about how we ask questions, right? Because dialogic questions, right? So we think about how do we ask better dialogic questions. There's lots of kinds of questions in the world, and they exist in lots of different ways, and they're useful at different times, right? When we think about dialogic questions, they are questions that are specifically promote individual and collective learning, right? They are not so much the knowledge assessment questions that we often ask, but they are really about trying to generate further learning. It doesn't mean knowledge assessment questions aren't important and don't need to be a part of what you do in a classroom or what we do in museums, but we want to differentiate what our purpose is when we ask a question. So, dialogic questions, they are open-ended questions. Everyone's like, yes, I know about those. Use them all the time. Great. I'm not going to dive too much into questions that have no right or wrong answer. Leave them there. We're going to talk about a subset of open-ended questions, of those dialogic questions, right? Those are going to be questions that not only don't have a right or wrong answer, but that people can answer from their own lived experience, okay? Because asking a question that somebody can't answer doesn't help us learn from them, doesn't draw out something new that gets added into the conversation and becomes part of collectively how we expand our truth of the world. So we want to look for questions that everybody's going to be able to answer. A couple other quick rules of thumb that we want to ask, think about when we're thinking about dialogic questions. Don't ask a question you wouldn't be able to answer yourself. Right? Kind of thinking about what's the appropriate level of trust that's needed there. The other is don't ask a question that you don't want to know the answer to, right? And there's the side of that that's about too much information. Don't do that. But really what that's saying is if you're not genuinely excited to hear people's, what they add to the conversation, right? If you're not genuinely curious about some perspective that they have, you're missing some key part of what's going to make this dialogue work. You're missing some key part of how there's an unknown for you in this, and that your own learning can grow through this. Right? So when I was at the Douglas House, Frederick Douglass National Historic Site in DC, we would spend a long time talking with students about questions that I don't have the answer to. Right? Questions about when violence is okay, thinking about him in terms of the Civil War and resisting slavery. Right? So when is violence justified? When can you take a life? Right? When can you break a law? Questions I was always happy to hear their answers to every day. Okay. So some examples of what this might look like from another New York location, right? Tenement Museum at the top one. So a factual question, right? If we're doing factual knowledge assessment, will be where might someone turn for financial assistance during the Panic of 1873? That open-ended knowledge assessment question would be what form of social welfare was most effective, right? But if you don't know a lot about the Panic of 1873, tough to answer that, right? Where would you turn for assistance during difficult economic times? Brings people into the conversation and starts to say, hey, just based off of what you know, where you are, how would you do this? So we're going to we're going to pause there, and I'm going to give you a few seconds to just practice with dialogic questions, right? Because they're a tool you've probably used things very similar to, but so kind of based off what we've talked about today, the little bit of content that you may know about this, or the lots of content you may know, some of the things that came up in the when we were talking about the forensic truths. Go ahead and start dropping some dialogic questions in the chat that you would like to ask with your students, that you are curious to have them dive in about. I love this, right? You were going from that super personal, right? How do we want to tell people how to pronounce our names, right? Up to those big questions, right? How do we keep each other safe? What a question that goes right to the core of this, and some things that people are thinking about. Yeah. Okay. Two things that I'm seeing, these are great questions, right? And stuff that's going to lead to a lot of challenge and learning with students. And all places that I hope you can see that content from the exhibit would enrich and expand it, right? So that they're not just answering this in a vacuum, but they're answering it as you're also sharing information that doesn't give them an answer to that, right? Their understanding of safety in their community is going to be their own, but hopefully we can make it more complex, make it richer, maybe give them some part of the solution they hadn't thought about before through the content that's being shared. Yeah, really nice job. Two things that just to call out that I'm seeing in there that I would add to this, right? One is we have a tendency to ask people to, in our questions, to stay on the side of the good and the righteous, right? So when has something bad happened to you? When did somebody do something mean to you? What was that experience like? And what we find is that as we build trust with people, it's important to bring them into both sides of that conversation, right? So yes, when were you excluded from a space? But also, when have you made the choice to exclude people, right? When have you sought justice? But when have you denied somebody else's request for justice, right? Why did you turn away from that request, right? So we want to think about both sides of that. Another is that hypotheticals are better with younger students. They get a little tougher as folks get older, because we start talking less as ourselves and we start talking more as some kind of an imaginary character. So it's there's a place for them, but just be aware of using them versus asking people to kind of speak for themselves there. If you're interested in learning more about dialogue and wanting to dive into this more in a couple different ways, right? There's the toolkit. There's some resources on the Coalition's webpage and we've got a couple, I think we've got some of our webinars where we've talked about dialogue in a little bit more depth up on our YouTube page. And generally, like, we are here to try and help move the information, relationships, and knowledge that folks need to do their work more around the world. So lean on NMAI. They're the lead on this. They're the experts. They've got the most resources here. But if there's ever a way that us or a member can be of support or aid to you in your work, please reach out, and we'd love to connect you with the folks who are best able to do that. So I'll drop my email in the chat box and hope that we can all keep the conversation going forward. And thanks so much for taking time today.
Thank you so much, Braden, for giving us that introduction to dialogue. We're also going to post a link in the chat to where you can learn more about the National Museum of the American Indians Native Knowledge 360 initiative. And this is an initiative that provides educators and students with new perspectives on Native American history and cultures. And on our website, you can find online classroom lessons, guided virtual student programs, and other teacher training opportunities. Thank you everyone for joining us on this Thursday afternoon, and we'll hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.